Hello, this is Tijen Genco. This is Coaching with Mastery and Elegance with Tijen Genco. And I have this second in the Masterful Coaching series, and I have such a pleasure to host my friend and colleague, Joel DiGirolamo. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you, Tijen. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. And Joel is a VP of Research and Data Sciences of International Coach Federation. So in this episode, we started the first episode talking about how mastery is from the mentor's point of view. Now we need to talk about how do we measure mastery. Before we get into that though, Joel, what would you like our audience to know about you?
Well, TJ and I have a little bit of an eclectic background. So I started my working career as an electrical engineer, got an MBA along the way, and then have an industrial and organizational psychology degree. And so I started at ICF about 10 years ago and began working in the science of coaching, as we say. And it's been an absolutely fascinating journey. And so over the time period that I've been there, we've updated our competency model. We've done a lot of research in terms of understanding the levels, like you're talking about, the levels of coaching and getting up to mastery level. And it's a fascinating experience, and I've really enjoyed working with and meeting people and hearing stories of folks such as yourselves who are, really, really good, thoughtful, experienced coaches, and to hear how you do it. So it's been a really a joyful journey, and it's a pleasure to be here to share what little I can with you.
Well, what you're going to share is not going to be little, but it's wonderful to have this. And one of the things that we have in common, we both have the engineering background. So let's see how geeky we can make this conversation. So, Joel, when you actually when we think about the mastery, right, you have this role that you're governing in a way for the International Coaching Federation, the measurement of not only mastery, but also the beginning levels and the intermediate levels and the mastery and maybe even beyond, because that's how we met. I was wondering what is the beyond of the MCC looks like. And so when you think about that from the practitioner point of view, how do you define mastery?
Excellent question. Excellent question. It's really fascinating. And there's a video that's unfortunately no longer available. It was on the internet for a while, that there was a Hungarian archer, and the video showed him on horseback, shooting with his arrows at these targets, the fixed targets. And you're riding on horseback, so the horse is moving, you may have wind and all this stuff, and it's like, how do you do that? And so if you think about that how this person is working, how he's doing his craft, it's coming from within, and it doesn't necessarily come from here. And we talk about embodying an art or a practice. And if you read the expertise literature, that you'll see that there's a lot of that in any field. That what happens is sort of like they talk about, you learn the rules, you apply the rules, and then you start to break the rules in any field. And it's sort of the same in coaching. And so if I really enjoy listening to masterful coaching conversations. because they're so fluid and they're so dynamic. And it's like, it didn't seem like that was a coaching conversation. It just seemed like it was a conversation.
Mm.
But yet the client got a lot of value out of it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's several aspects. You know, number one, it seems very easy. And number two is very fluid and dynamic.
Mm. There is also one more point in that video that you shared with us that is moving with mastery and precision through the space and not wasting time and effort, right? That there is the target, there is the precision, it goes, and doesn't matter how fast you're going. And there is that the oneness with the vessel, that is the horse, and with the vessel, that is the archery, and all that. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's those multiple dimensions, and it's like as you become a master, things slow down.
Mm.
And two things. One is that there's a coach who's a very experienced coach who has a training program, education program. And I was talking to him one day several years ago and asked him, what's your, when you listen to a coach that's that you view as a masterful coach, what do you hear? And one of the things that he said was, he said, economy of words.
Mm.
And I think he's right. You know, I listen to these conversations and there's not a lot said by the coach. And if you look at some of the metrics and the idea of percentage of time that the client talks, percentage of time that the coach talks, and, you know, with a higher level conversation, the coach is going to be talking much less.
Yeah.
Now, the second point that I wanted to make is that I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with two very experienced researchers, and it was just our first conversation with the three of us, and we were just exploring, hey, what might we be able to do, you know, with ICF and these other two organizations. And what was fascinating to me was the amount of silence in the conversation, because the three of us, we had none of us had an agenda, none of us had anything to prove. You know, we're published, you know, we're accomplished in our fields, I guess. Yeah. And so the conversation was just fairly slow, and it was like I got off this conversation, I thought, wow, that was really interesting. And the parallel with these coaching conversations, you know, that they do slow down. There are fewer words. They're more thoughtful. They're more wide ranging. They can be fairly divergent. So they're just they're a lot more fun.
They are, and often that when I'm mentoring others or teaching coaching to others, I notice two things. One is I call it coaching under the table. When the coach isn't comfortable about sharing what they're observing, then they clutter their words a lot to hide in a way, not to be clear. And that kind of gets, as you become masterful, it's also your spirit develops, your comfort level develops to present an idea to another human being. And the other one I often teach as a distillation of the conversation, because the client is presenting something to you, or a friend, as you said, and you're hearing and understanding and then distilling what is presented, because we talk more when there is a trauma in the place than we clutter the space. Then the coach's ability to do that, that's what I'm hearing. That's lovely. And you also developed a coach skill progression chart. What would you like our audience to know about that?
Well, it's really fascinating to think about that chart. It's an inverted U, and in psychology, there are a lot of inverted U curves. And I remember many years ago, I get a lot of stuff that comes to me. People are like, "Hey, Joel, what about this model? And I really like this model. Could you guys incorporate it and all that stuff?" And so one person, they were pretty persistent, came back several times and said, and so I had a conversation with them, and I, uh, I said, well, yes, I can see that, but it just seems really complicated what you're proposing. And so then I thought, well, okay, it's not fair to say you don't like something. I always say this: you can't say I don't like that and not offer an alternative.
Oh.
So I'm like, okay, what alternative do I have? And I drew this inverted U curve. And the curve, the x-axis, so we can get into engineering mode, the x-axis is time. So we're progressing in time. And the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the amount of cognitive stuff that you're putting in. So we can think about starting at the bottom, t equals zero, t zero. We go back to our engineering days. And at the beginning, and so imagine you're starting your coach education and you're learning, okay, what is coaching? What are the schemas? What are the models of how coaching works? And so you start having this paradigm of, okay, we're building a rapport. We're going to ask some questions. We're going to hopefully trigger some awareness in the client and have set some goals, have some positive outcomes, that sort of thing. And so then you learn techniques, you learn tools. And so these are more and more cognitive things that you're building. And Carol Kaufman has a concept that she calls model agility. And so what she's proposing is that you have all these models and that you're agile, that you can switch from model to model. And so I think that's great. That's fantastic. And so if you think about over time moving more and more models, you're thinking more and more, what model might I apply? And then it's like you're full up to here. And so then what can happen is, getting back to the expertise thing, you start to embody it and you start to practice, and it just flows out of you. It just comes out of you. And you actually aren't thinking anymore. And so I like to make espresso drinks. I like to make my cappuccinos. And so I'm foaming my milk in my frothing pitcher, right? And, after a while, I'm not thinking about it. I'm not thinking, okay, the wand has to be, so deep into the milk and it's making this noise. And, I hold it here so it swirls. I just do it.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing with coaching. You have all these models, and then after a while they just kind of fall away, and you just do it. You just coach. And so when I listen to a really experienced coach who's done a lot of coaching, very experienced and very good at their art, the conversations are just weaving all over.
Yeah.
And I just really enjoyed that. And it's like, like I said earlier, it's like that was a conversation. That wasn't a coaching. That wasn't a coaching session, but it was. Yeah. And so that's where the client can have these positive outcomes. They can feel like they had a really good conversation, and yet they had something, really profound or insightful come out of it. And so as those things just pop up and emerge, I think it's fabulous. And so, you think about the time over time then that you're using less models. And so then now you're down the backside of that curve. And we can also think about, there's the 10,000 hours kind of thing that has been since debunked, but there was this idea that it took 10,000 hours of practice to become proficient. And what you find is that it's the same concept, that you get those hours in and it becomes embodied in you, and you become more masterful, more spontaneous in how the coaching emerges.
What I think about as I hear you, Joel, that couple of things you shared, that you're talking about reverse bell curve, and I'm also thinking about digital signal versus analog signal, right? That in the beginning, the coaching is more like a digital, shifting from one model to the next, and the coach is robotic in a way. And then it goes into a more analog signal that it's so smooth. And as you have been sharing, I use this metaphor as I again teach coaching, that often students say, oh, there are too many competencies. How are we going to demonstrate this, that, the other thing? And what is this? And I often say to them, they're not linear. You just need to understand and embrace them. They're like a grammatical rules. You learn the grammar and then you can break it to make poems out of it. I think that's what you are talking about with this coach skill progression chart. And what I heard, the importance is there, that the understanding different evidence-based or esoteric methodologies, depending on the how the coach views their craft, right, and expresses. And then there is the seamless dance between them based on what the moment requests.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to steal that.
Which one?
Digital versus analog.
That is so true.
That's an excellent analog analogy.
Exactly. Oh, that's so sweet. So, how then, if at all, your coach skill progression chart plays in the development of the instruments? As when I'm saying instruments, for those of the viewers are not familiar with what we're talking about, Joel is one of the persons who's responsible of the exactly measurements of the outcomes that, as we assess for International Coaching Federation, credentialing for the ACC, the PCC, and MCC. So how is that your model, if at all, plays into such measurements?
Now you're asking hard questions.
Secret sauce.
Secret sauce. Yeah, what's a secret sauce? How do I pass the test, right? It's just good. Remember in college, people this used to bug me like crazy. People would ask, is this going to be on the test?
Or they ask me tips and tricks. What are there is no tip and there is no tricks. The coaching is coaching.
Yeah. So hard question. Assessing is really, really hard. So I'll state that up front. And so we try to do the best we can. At the lower levels, we see more of this use of models, and that's kind of what's expected, that there will be the conversations may not be so fluid. They may be a little bit more disjointed, or the conversations might not flow as much. The coaches might be uncomfortable with silence, for example. And it's really fascinating. The silence is a really important thing, because we see that at the higher levels, more silence. And I was so I'm an American. I was born in America, and it's fascinating because Americans don't like silence, right? You've probably noticed that, coming from
No, not from coming from Turkey, no.
Okay, but the finish, you talk to the finish, and they have a saying that I'll probably get this wrong, but it's something like, if you can't sit with your friend in silence for 5 minutes, they're not your friend.
Mm,
So it's really fascinating to think about the difference in culture and how this idea of silence at the lower levels, the coaches might not be so comfortable with that. So we see that things are, like you're saying, a little more digital than analog, and that as you move up through PCC professional level, then there's this artistry is starting to enter,
mm,
and things are starting to become more fluid. And then at the highest level, and frankly, that is the hardest to assess, because it's like a painting. How do you say, oh, this is a really good painting? Uh, you might enjoy a painting of a white background with a red circle on it and say, oh, I love this painting. And I might be like, yeah, or like the Campbell soup can, right? Let's go to Andy Warhol. It's like can of Campbell soup. It's like, yep, can of soup. But some people love it. And I think it's okay. I think it's extremely creative.
mm,
So, how do you measure art? How do you measure this? And so we can look for certain aspects or certain elements, and how well at the highest level, how well is the coach taking into account the whole client, for example, holistically, what all they've talked about in maybe the entire engagement,
mm,
in those conversations, and how well are they really working with, and how well they really developed a rapport with
mm,
that client. And so those are some of the indicators, that we're looking for. And and it's kind of like, how well does it flow? Is it
mm,
flowing? Is there silence? And is the silence being used strategically, for
mm.
example? Um, one person once told me that the most profound thing their coach did was, hmm.
That makes sense. You know what makes me think what you're sharing is there is a podcast with Krista Tippett and Yo-Yo, and Yo-Yo says that the music happens in between the notes. The silence, the space
Mhm.
defines. And we often, in the Western world, we're focused on what interrupts the space, not the space that
Mhm.
holds everything in, right? That
Mhm.
and as I hear you, I'm hearing that the way you are measuring the mastery is the capacity to interrelate and and hold. This is a quite often used language, but hold the space for another
Mhm.
being. What I often again teach is to, when students are so concerned about how the demonstrate the competencies, I say that there is a masterpiece in front of you. Every
Mhm.
human being is a masterpiece. When you focus on that masterpiece to understand and appreciate that somebody is willing to open up in front of you and then be awed by that, then the competencies will be flowing out of you. What do you
Mhm.
think about that?
Absolutely. And I agree with your statement about don't worry about the competencies, you know? Uh, think about it, and don't even think about the discussion.
Mm,
The goal is not to have a discussion, right? But that's what that's what, and I know when I was coaching, I was focused on the discussion for the longest time. And then I'm like, wait a minute, the discussion doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's a masterpiece. And how are you creating that masterpiece in your client?
Mm.
That's all you're doing. And if it's a white background with a red circle and that's all you have to do,
Exactly.
great, great. It's interesting because I don't know if you know the name Peter Szabo.
Mm-mm.
So Peter has done some work with some other folks on brief coaching. There's brief therapy, there's brief coaching, and I've read some of their work, and a question I had, if you read Eric DeHaan's work, for example, he's done a lot of research on the relationship and how much does the relationship account for the outcomes in coaching. The therapy world, they did decades of research on how much effect does the relationship have on the outcome of the therapy. And I could go down that rabbit hole and but I won't for now. But the thing that intrigued me as I got to thinking about this, well, what's this deal about relationship? And I can see how intuitively it might be important. It probably is very important, but why and to what aspect? And so then I saw some of Peter and some of these other folks' work on brief coaching, brief therapy. And so I had to hunt down Peter. He's hard to find. And he's in Basel, Switzerland. And I finally hunted him down. He finally responded to my email. And I'm like, Peter, you are a hard guy to get a hold of. And so I asked him, I said, how do you do this? How do you develop this rapport, this relationship with your client in 20 minutes, in a 20-minute session? And Peter and I had been talking at this point for about 15 or 20 minutes. And he said, aren't we doing it right now?
Yeah, and I think that people often ask questions to beginning coaches. Oh, what did you do over the weekend? And this, that, the other thing. And then they leave that conversation. And then like, what do you want to talk about? They get panicked and the time goes by. And I say, that's not the way to establish a rapport. Because if you want to establish a rapport with somebody, reflect on meaningful way what you heard or understand their values. I almost never ask anybody that what are your values, because it's a hard question to answer, but you can hear what their values are when they're telling you something. So there are different ways to establish a rapport in a very rapid way if one pays attention to what other person's saying. But I think it was Margaret was saying at some point that we don't listen to understand, we listen to respond. So we're often thinking about what we're going to say, then we're missing the whole thing.
Yes, yes, yes. And there's a very important thing. Some of our research that we did, this was back in 2017, it would have been, when we were looking at the doing our job analysis about the core competencies to see if we should update them or not. And of course we did. But one of the things we did was had SMEs, subject matter experts, very experienced coaches, ask them to write critical incidents. So what did the client come in with? What did they do? And then what was the outcome? And so I took, and we asked them to rate them 1 through 5, 5 being best outcome, 1 being okay outcome. And so I think there were 60 some of them maybe, that were rated 5. And I asked myself, what are the kernels? What's the heart of each of these? And it was fascinating. The client came in, the client talked, the coach listened, the coach did something, maybe asked questions, but maybe did something else. And then there was some positive outcome. So the question is, how much rapport did they have to have?
Mm.
And I maintain, and maybe this is controversial, but I maintain that it's not necessarily rapport, it's safety.
Mm.
Does the client feel safe enough to talk openly and expose themselves, make themselves feel vulnerable to the coach, sufficiently that they can get out in front on the screen? We used to say on the table, but I think now we need to say on the screen, to get on the screen the words out about what they want to work on, how they feel, and so forth. And that's really all that it takes.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. And yeah, I think that gets into a little bit of the space that we talked about. How do you create that space so that the client feels comfortable for self-expression, especially the things they never expressed before, right?
Right.
And you and I have another thing in common, yoga sciences. What, if anything, that you wish to speak about, that the creation of the space or anything else that from your rich background that supported your mastery?
Well, it's part of my education in my undergraduate. I took some philosophy classes, and I took some Eastern philosophy. And if you go back to Taoism, not the Taoist religion necessarily, but the Taoist philosophy, excuse me, they have this concept of the empty vessel. And I think, for me, I can remember when I was coaching that I would want to be the empty vessel. And I would be asking the client, trying to pull out of them, their goals and their values, and get the energy moving in them. And so, I could, there's a million different directions I could go with this. And so, you think of that idea of the empty vessel and you think of the energy flow. And in yoga, I frequently, when I'm teaching, if I'm teaching maybe a standing pose, and I will speak, I'll say, think of the energy flowing up through your feet, through your legs, through your torso, maybe out through your arms, to your head, and that energy flow. And if you think in coaching, you can see that, you can feel that energy flow. And so it's the client who's supposed to be doing the work, right? And so, and if you think about the less experienced coaches, they're working hard, right? They're working the session. And the masterful coaches are like, so which way is the energy flow there, And so it's fascinating to bring in. I think you're very, very correct in thinking about bringing these other modalities in. And, a lot of coaches do that. When I talk to them, they'll say, oh, yeah, I pull this in from this other field. And yeah.
That makes me think about, I was just, I have an upcoming energetic coach training class, and I was talking one of my students about that. She was asking me what I developed and why I developed and all that. And I was talking about the magnetism in humanoid, right? That we have polarities, the positive, that the young oriented action thing, and then the negative, which is often taken as N negative, which is not true, which is the negative of the battery humanoid. And what I'm hearing you makes me think about that the negative aspect, ability to assume that so that the energy can flow, what needs to flow out of somebody, it can start flowing. And that I have a prayer before the sessions that I say, let there be no me, whatever the client needs, come to and through me. And
That's awesome.
so yeah, that's
Yeah.
that. That's what I was thinking. So in in your approach to mastery, Joel, what in what ways, if at all, that you deviated from the masters that you had as you found your way?
I don't know that I don't know if the right word would be deviate.
Mm.
I think it's fascinating. And so Bob Hogan assessments, Ian Joyce came up with all those assessments. And one of his big things is that we cannot be self-aware. I could still hear Bob's voice, and one time he and I were chatting, and I said something to him about, well, Bob's self-awareness, blah blah blah, and he's like, Joel, there is no such thing as self-awareness. We will delude ourselves every single time. And I'm like, okay, Bob, you're right. And so he writes a lot. He says, reputation. And so we can, when we really can judge ourselves and how we're being perceived, how people are viewing our behaviors, our values, are from what we hear from other people, right? And so a good friend of mine, she said to me once, she said, Joel, her boyfriend, he said, he said to me that Joel is one of the few people that I know that can do the spiritual and the mundane,
Simultaneously.
he can have his sports car, but still enjoy the meditation and the mindfulness, right? And so it's, and I've done a ton of work. I mean, I've done Kundalini work, I've done the yoga, energy work with a guy in Serbia that I studied with for a long, long time. And and Albert Einstein tells us, right? It's all energy.
Yeah.
There is really no mass. It's all energy. And so how does this energy flow, and how does it manifest itself, right? This finger, this hand may seem hard, but it's not. And it's just the manifestation of it is possibly different from the reality of it. Mm-hmm. And so when we're having these conversations with clients, what is that energetic flow? And what is the reality? What is the perception? Mm-hmm. We have a perception of, you have a perception of what's going on in this conversation right now, and I have a perception of what's going on in this conversation, and they may not be the same, but they might be pretty close to the same. So what I have learned over the years, and all the hard work that I've done, that there is this realm of something, you could call it spiritual, you can call it energetic, whatever. And then there's this mundane physical world that we have. And so how do we flow, and how do we work within those realms and with the clients? And I kind of think of the models. We talk about the models and all these, the digital art in your world, that how do we transcend those, mm-hmm. and get above those and get into that energetic space and to feel that with our clients, and to move back and forth between those, pretty seamlessly.
Mm.
How can we make that happen?
Mm.
I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Oh,
But
it does to me. That's your arrival space, and which is very similar to, I call it transcendental coaching. That's the sustainable, but because if somebody is not transcending, their relationship to the thing, whatever the thing that feels like a problem, is the same. But when they transcend, that is the new relationship. That's then it's just, there is nothing to solve. It's just that go into a different context and have a different relationship, right?
and that's all reframing is, right?
Yes.
When you talk
Yes.
about reframing, it's like, oh,
Yes.
okay. And so if I take this pen and it looks like a pen, right? But if I show it to you this way, oh, that's just a circle.
Exactly. And I love circles. Okay, good. Then that's it, right? That's all. Oh, such a beautiful conversation. So, anything else you wanted to share with our audience before we close, Joe? About the mastery, the measurements, or whatever is in your beautiful heart and in your energy.
Well, the measurement's kind of boring to most people, but being a geek, it's fun, and it's a fascinating world to me. But I think the thing I'd like to share is, and you talked about it going into your conversation, saying a little prayer, and it's really interesting because I was listening to the end of an interview this morning while I was cooking breakfast, and for one of our studies, and the person was that I know, I happen to know the interviewee pretty well, and they were kind of a hard person, like hard charging, and they talked about their, it's like the pregame show. It's like what they did before the session, deep breathing, reviewing the notes, getting themselves into a good space. And I wouldn't have thought about that. So I think the thing I'd like to leave folks with is let it slow down. Just let it slow down and let it emerge. And you don't need to try to force anything. And let it be spontaneous and let that flow happen and see what grows from that energetic flow
Yeah.
and enjoy it.
Yeah.
Find joy in the session.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. And it's another thing that students often complain, oh, well, I don't like unknown. I don't like unknown. And I say to them, well, guess what? The known is the same potential. Unknown is the new potential. If anything, coaches needs to be really moved by the unknown, right?
Yeah, and uh, I don't remember where I heard this, but I was I was always afraid as a coach. What if I don't know what to do? And I heard this one person, I don't remember who they were, but they said, it's okay to tell your client, I don't know what to do here.
Yes. Partner,
I'm
right?
really, I'm really at a loss. I
Exactly.
don't know what to do here. What do you think?
Absolutely. And then partner. They often have an idea. Yeah.
Hmm.
That's a beautiful space to end with. And thank you, Joel, for being here and participating in this lovely conversation. And everyone, thank you for tuning in what you've been listening to. In case you missed the beginning, this is Coaching with Mastery and Elegance with Tijen Genco. And it's an original podcast from Genco Coaching. If you like what you heard, continue to watching us. You can like us and find us in wherever you're tuning into. And you can find additional resources at gencocoaching.com or Amazon. And thank you for being with us today.